For about 75 years, America was a nation trying to outrun its own shadow, patching things together with fragile deals in pretty desperate bargains. So, what we're going to do is trace that whole journey from this massive expansion to a really violent conflict and see how all those compromises finally and just catastrophically fell apart. Let's jump in. It really all boils down to what sounds like a simple question. How could something as good, as optimistic as getting more land lead directly to a country breaking in two? That's the core question we're really going to explore here. So, our story plays out in about 5 acts. We're going to start with the expansion that kind of created the problem in the first place, then look at all the political deals that were supposed to fix it. We'll see the exact moment those deals just collapsed into violence, watch how the war itself totally changed the nation's purpose, and then finally, look at one last compromise that would end up shaping the next 100 years. Okay, so let's go back to 1803. President Thomas Jefferson makes this incredible deal with France that literally doubles the size of the United States overnight. The Louisiana Purchase, it was a massive win, but it also opened a total Pandora's box of problems that would haunt the country for decades. And this really gets to the heart of it. All of a sudden, you've got all this new territory that needs to be organized. And for every single new state that wants to join the Union, the country had to answer this one single, explosive question. Would it be a free state or a slave state? With the North and South already so divided, every answer threatened to just shatter the country's really fragile balance of power. So for the next few decades, American politics basically becomes this high-wire act. The goal, you have to understand, wasn't to solve the slavery question. Not at all. It was just to manage it, to kick the can down the road with a series of these incredibly delicate political bargains, all designed just to keep the North and the South from walking away. The first huge test comes in 1820. It's the Missouri Compromise, a classic political deal. So, to keep the number of free and slave states perfectly balanced, Maine comes in as a free state and Missouri comes in as a slave state. Then, Congress just draws a line on the map, the 36° 30 parallel, and says, okay, no slavery north of this line. It was a temporary fix, a literal line in the sand. But here's the huge flaw in the plan. That compromise only applied to the land from the Louisiana Purchase. So when the U.S. gets all this new territory from the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, guess what? The exact same explosive debate erupts all over again. The problem wasn't solved, it just packed its bags and moved west. And that problem just exploded with the Compromise of 1850. This deal was way more complicated. The North was thrilled to get California in as a free state and to see the slave trade banned in Washington, D.C. But the South got something huge in return, a much, much stricter Fugitive Slave Act. This law actually forced people in the North to help capture and return escaped slaves. It brought the brutal reality of slavery right to their doorstep. And suddenly, you couldn't pretend to be neutral anymore. And this brings us to the 1850s, the decade where it all just fell apart. That delicate balance of compromise, which had kinda sorta held for so long, it just shattered. And the debate moved from the halls of Congress out into open, brutal violence. The speed of how things escalated in the 1850s is just staggering. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act completely throws out the old Missouri Compromise line. It introduces this idea of popular sovereignty, basically letting settlers vote on slavery themselves. Well, that led directly to Bleeding Kansas, a nasty little mini-civil war. And right in the middle of all that chaos, the Supreme Court drops a political bombshell in 1857. And this is the question that the Dred Scott decision forced the entire country to face. This wasn't just some dusty legal ruling. It was a moral and political earthquake that basically made every single compromise that came before it totally meaningless. The ruling had two just devastating parts. First, it said that African Americans, whether they were free or enslaved, were not citizens and had absolutely no rights in federal court. And second, it said that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. So in effect, the Supreme Court just blew up the entire idea of free territory, siding completely with the South and wiping out decades of compromise. After the Dred Scott decision, the possibility of some kind of political compromise was essentially dead. So the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who ran on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery, well, that was the final straw. For the South, his victory was a signal that their power in the federal government was totally gone. Secession and then war happened almost immediately. At first, the Civil War was really fought just to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But as the war dragged on and got bloodier, its very purpose began to change, and that was largely because of the actions and the evolving vision of President Lincoln.
So in 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand what this did and what it didn't do. It was a wartime measure, so it only freed slaves in the states that were in active rebellion, the Confederacy. It didn't apply to the slave states that stayed loyal to the Union. It was a strategic masterstroke, really, as much as it was a moral statement. But the impacts were immediate, and they were profound. The proclamation completely redefined the war's goals, turning it into a fight for human freedom. It opened the door for nearly 200,000 black soldiers to join the Union Army, which was critical. It also crippled the Southern economy, and, maybe just as important, it made it politically impossible for countries like Britain and France to support a confederacy that was now openly fighting to preserve slavery. Later that same year at Gettysburg, Lincoln just perfectly captured this new vision for the country. He framed the horrific sacrifice of the war as something necessary for a new birth of freedom, tying the very survival of American democracy directly to the cause of emancipation. Okay, so after the war, the nation enters this period called Reconstruction. It was this incredible, messy attempt to rebuild the South and integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into the country. But this amazing experiment in multiracial democracy was about to be cut short by one final, fateful compromise. The presidential election of 1876 was, and this is no exaggeration, one of the most chaotic in American history. There was widespread voter fraud, contested results in 3 southern states. The whole outcome was just completely up in the air. Both sides were claiming victory, and the country was teetering right on the edge of another conflict. The solution was the Compromise of 1877, which was basically an unwritten backroom deal. It was a very straightforward political trade. You get this, we get that. The Southern Democrats agreed to let the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, become president, and, in return, the Republicans agreed to pull the last of the federal troops out of the South. And that was it. That was the deal. See, those troops were the last thing protecting the political and civil rights of African Americans. When they left, that marked the official end of Reconstruction. The federal government basically just abandoned the whole project of enforcing equality, and the South was left on its own to build a new system of racial oppression that would last for almost a century. So when you look back, you see this 75-year chain of compromises, all designed to avoid a war over slavery that ended up leading to the nation's bloodiest war anyway. And then that war was brought to a close with yet another compromise, one that sacrificed the promise of freedom for political peace. Which leaves us with a pretty tough final question. Has the American story ever truly escaped that cycle?